Hey, what's up? It's Trent from Marmalade Cream Media, and I'm here with another podcast tip of the week. I owe you like 2 or 3 tips at this point. It's been a little while since I posted a tip, but hey, I've been busy. I do this full time, so I don't always have time to make videos. Things get in the way, and so that's just going to be the way it is. I'm not a full-time YouTuber yet. Who knows what might happen in the future. But I'm going to try to keep posting these. And my hope is that, as they come out, I've only got a couple videos up right now, but, as I go through this over like the course of a year or two, there'll be a whole library of videos, with different mixing tips and editing tips and production tips that, my hope is that they'll be evergreen. These tips won't just be something that's relevant for a short period of time. They should be relevant for, as long as we're still editing audio in a DAW, they hopefully should still be relevant. So thanks for bearing with me. All right, so today I wanted to talk about my mix template. And so I posted that I was doing these videos in a couple of forums, a couple of Facebook groups and Reddit subreddits and stuff. And I wanted to get some feedback on, what do people want to hear about? And a couple of questions that I got was about compression and dynamic range for podcasts. And man, that's a big topic. I actually sat down and tried to record a couple videos, and I just realized at the rate I was going, it was going to be like a 45-minute long video, and nobody wants to hear me talk that long. So what I thought I'd do instead is just talk through my mix template, because that's actually a big part of the way my template is set up, is to, like, basically once I've got the individual tracks gain staged correctly, so I've got them turned up or down to the right sort of ballpark level, then the rest of the plugins in my chain sort of take care of the dynamic range. But I'll, just sort of philosophically, really quick, I'll just say this about podcasts. It is a little bit of a puzzle that we have to solve with dynamic range in podcasts. And that's that we want podcasts to be fairly loud, right? So, you'll see the number thrown around all the time, minus 16 LUFS as being the right target volume for a finished mixed podcast. And it's a good ballpark. I'm not slavish about it. I'm like, not everything I put out has to be exactly bang on minus 16 LUFS. Sometimes I think they sound better a little bit quieter, like minus 18. But they're usually somewhere in that ballpark. But point is, for speech, for dialogue, that's actually pretty loud. That's significantly louder than, let's say, a TV show or dialogue that's mixed for film. If we're just talking about the dialogue part, not the like explosions and special effects. Those are usually it's like cannons going off. But for the dialogue and stuff, that's actually usually a lot quieter than what a podcast is. And it makes sense because we want a podcast to cut. We want it to cut through the noise of everyday life. So people are listening in their cars. They've got engine noise, they've got road noise, they've got traffic noise going on. You want your podcast to cut through that. Same thing. Somebody might be listening on headphones or earbuds or whatever, and they're on the train or the bus, public transportation. You want them to be able to hear your podcast clearly in all those environments without having to constantly reach for the volume knob. That's so annoying. I hate that. It turns me off of a show if I have to crank the volume way up to listen to something, and then something happens in the podcast and it gets really loud, like everybody laughs or something, and you got to reach for the volume knob, turn it down because it's blowing your ears out. We want to avoid that. We want it to sound nice and loud so it plays back on all systems well, like whether it's a phone, a Bluetooth speaker, earbuds, or car speakers, whatever. But we also want it to be balanced. We don't want it to have a lot of dynamic range. So we need to squash a podcast quite a bit. The trick is, anybody can just slap a compressor and a limiter on podcast audio and crush it down and make it smooth, so to speak. The problem is with the human voice, we're very sensitive to it, and the human voice starts to sound really weird if the compression artifacts are too obvious. So if you hear the compression, it can be really fatiguing to listen to. And I've heard some podcasts that are super compressed, and the dynamic range is controlled, but they are so fatiguing to listen to because I can just hear the pumping of the compressor, and it's like listening to FM radio hosts like for 45 minutes. It might work for a 30-second radio ad, but it's just super annoying and fatiguing to listen to for long form. So, and that's what we're doing here. Podcasts are usually long form mediums, and so we need compression that's going to squeeze our dynamic range down so it's very balanced and consistent, but at the same time sounds very natural. We want to sound as natural as possible. So that's what I'm going to talk through today really quick with my mix template. What I do is how I get that squashed yet very natural sounding audio. So let's dive right into it. So the way I have my mix template set up is I've got my individual tracks here, right? In this case, this example I've pulled up I'm working on, I've got 2 tracks, right? But I can duplicate these and go as many as I need to, 3, 4, 6, whatever. And then you'll notice down here below, there's all these tracks that are sort of squinched down. Those are work tracks. So those are tracks that they're all muted. You can see this yellow M indicator says that they're muted, so they're not being used. What I might do sometimes is while I'm editing, if I have like, I don't know, like a section of audio that's clipped or something that I need to repair, I will pull that down into my declip tool, right? Whatever tool I need for that little piece of audio, I will render it as a new piece of audio, and then I will pull the new rendered bit of audio that's fixed back into the session. So that's now the good audio that's fixed, and the original audio that I repaired is back down there. And in fact, I usually do it so I can flip between the two quite easily. But then, so what I did, the original that's down there is just muted, so it's not going to play back. So that's what you see there. So I've got individual tracks, I've got work tracks. So you can ignore all this stuff down here because that's just for editing purposes. So for each individual track, I have a bunch of plugins. Now, I'm not using all of them every session, but I just have a bunch of tools that are all loaded so that I can easily grab them. And they're just sort of my go-to for the typical problems that I run into. The first thing is just, it's just a gain stage thing. It's just a volume adjuster in Reaper. That's what it's called, volume adjustment. And this tool just allows me to turn up or down the track as it comes in. So I drop in the raw track. Here's where it is. This one was pretty quiet. Like you can kind of see that the waveforms are a little small. So it was pretty quiet. Now I could just sit here and turn up the waveform and make it louder there. That would work. But sometimes I'm turning things up or down in the edit. So like, if I've got a really loud breath, I might turn it down like 6 or 10 dB, somewhere around there. And so if I'm starting from a point that's like +9, and then I want to turn it down 10 dB, well, that's actually -1 dB. It gets confusing, right? So what I like to do is just leave the raw audio waveform here. I like to leave the clip as it is, and then do my balancing, my rough balancing here with a plugin. So in this case, this was a little quiet coming in, so I boosted it 9 decibels, and my whole goal is basically when I'm gain staging the clip up or down, is to get it roughly bouncing around between -24 and -12 dB. And that's bouncing up and down. So this is going to average somewhere between -18 and -12 on the meter in the DAW once I apply this gain, right? So it's just getting things up to a consistent level, and then all the other plugins following down the chain are going to get fed that consistent level. That way, I don't want to be turning things up or down between plugins because it just gets confusing and you forget like, oh yeah, this plugin was boosting at 6 dB, so I got to turn it down if I use it there. It gets confusing. I like to get all my gain staging done up front, so it's all at just a rough level that I want it, ballpark that I want it to be at, and then all the plugins just sort of stay at unity gain from there. So then after that, I've just got a bunch of utility stuff. This is like repair. It's just kind of cleanup tools. I've got an instance of EQ just in case I need to do any like tight cuts of just like noise or ground hum or stuff. I've got Isotope RX. There's a number of modules that you can run in real time, and that's the way I tend to use them. So I've got denoise. I'm usually running that on most shows. If they have any background noise, I'm usually running it at least lightly. So in this case, I've got, this reduction. I usually leave it between like 4 and 8. I don't want to hear the noise reduction too much because it can get a little weird and dull sounding if you push it too hard. So just a very light amount of noise reduction there. If I need it, de-reverb. Sometimes you got to fix echoey environments. Mouth declick. I use this a lot. I tend to almost always run this. It just cleans up the mouth smacky noises, that kind of stuff. That can be a little gross or just annoying or distracting. So it just helps clean up some of that. It's not going to catch the big stuff. It's not going to catch the big lip smacks. You're going to have to edit those out, but it will catch the low-level stuff, and it just makes things a little smoother, especially when we're close miking stuff, which is almost all the time. Deplosive, this is really nice if somebody pops the mic. There's a secret, though. It's also really good if you just got too much proximity effect. It can be useful to just lightly tame the low end without cutting a bunch of it out. So I use that there. And then breath control. I don't use this very often, but it's there just in case I have someone who just is like huffing air constantly. It can do some of the it can turn the breaths down automatically for me. Then we come into the actual like tone shaping, right? This is where I'm actually balancing the voice. And I've got a few things in the chain here. Basically, EQ is the main thing going on here. I'm going to skip over a couple things. Most of what I do is going to happen in this SSL channel strip. So solid state logic channel strip, this is the one made by Solid State Logic. There's a whole bunch of different versions out there. Most of them are really good. I've used the Waves one in the past, the 4000E series. That was great. This one, I believe, is modeled on one of their more modern, is modeled on one of their more modern, like boards, mixing consoles. It's not, I don't think it's modeled precisely on the old 4000 series or even 9000 series SSLs. I think it's a more modern, very clean digital version, but the EQ curves here, which is mainly what you care about when you use this plugin, are selectable between the old G series or the E series EQ. And I like the G series because they just have nice smooth curves when you push a frequency band up or when you cut. It's just got a nice smoothness to it that I like on the voice. I don't want my EQ to be too colorful. So it's nice and clean and clear. And for me, I really like seeing knobs. I don't like seeing a bunch of graphical representations of my signal, because for me it just ends up mixing with my eyeballs. I'm like, whoa, that looks like that spike over there at 500 hertz is really big. I should probably cut that. Whereas with knobs, I just listen to like what does this thing need or not need, and then I start turning knobs to correct that. So for instance here, it's usually pretty subtle moves for me. I'm going to turn this off here and play a little bit.
Eric and Kevin run a predominantly buy-side M&A transaction firm. Eric and Kevin run
all it's doing is it's like cutting a little bit of low mids out, boosting the low end just a little bit, and adding a little bit of top end as well. And I do that, quite a lot. It's also got filters here, which is super useful. So you've got your low pass filter to cut out the super low stuff you don't need that's below the fundamental of the human voice. And I usually low pass as well, just kind of the super, super high stuff. I can't even hear it up there anyway, so don't need it in the mix. I also really like the dynamic section. I've talked about this in another video, but the dynamic section is super useful. It's basically what I use is the expander in it. It will turn down the audio when the guest or when the host stops talking. So host stops talking, the expander just pushes down the noise floor by a set amount of dB. So somewhere around 15 to 20 dB for me. So it cleans things up. It cleans up a lot of low-level noise and ambient noise floor without totally killing it like a noise gate would, and sounds much more natural. And I just like the SSL version of that because it's just really easy to use and it's very smooth sounding. It's never seems to be real jumpy. It's very smooth sounding and gets me there right away. So I love this channel strip. This is where I'm doing the bulk of my work. If I have a hard case where I've got a lot of S sounds or something, I use TDR Nova as well. This one's really great. It's basically does dynamic EQ that can push down a particular frequency range. Usually, though, if for just basic de-essing, I'm using just an instance of this isotope de-ess. Super simple. You just pick the band, frequency band you use, so 5K and up, and then you just pick the threshold to
Eric and Kevin
catch
run
some S's.
Predominantly buy-side M&A transaction.
Yeah, so it's just kind of lightly touching the S sound so they're not too sharp. In this case, I've also got some other tone shaping options, basically a few different analog style EQs for specific purposes. So in this one, I'm kind of managing a nasally, this guy's got a little bit of a nasally kind of mid-range. And so this, basically it's a Pultec style mid-range equalizer. It allows me to kind of very smoothly shape that into something a little more pleasant. And sometimes I want a different style of top-end boost, and I've got a couple options there. And then finally, for dynamics, this is the big thing, right? Compression. This is a big tool that I use. At the very end of all of my individual track chains is Vocal Writer. Now, this one's made by Waves, and there's a bunch of different versions of this out there now. I think a bunch of different plugin companies have one. But basically what it does is it's like a compressor in that it will turn down stuff that gets too loud, but it also will turn stuff up if it's too quiet. So basically it's like having a little man there sitting there riding the fader of the track up and down to keep the track within a target volume range. So basically you set your target volume range here at, in my case, a 21 dB, because I know 21 dB, when it becomes a stereo show, it's going to be dual mono. It's going to go to 18 dB. So it kind of gets me very close to that 16 LUFS number or 18 LUFS, minus 18 LUFS that I'm chasing. So that's what I do. So basically you set the target volume and then you set the speed of how fast it's going to react. And I always have it on a very fast setting. And I turn that speed up almost all the way. And it basically will just sit there and ride the fader up and down. You can also set the range here of how far you will let it go. I usually let it go up and down quite a bit. And then, yeah, I'll play some audio. You can see it.
Eric and Kevin run
so you can see there's a little bit of a spike there, where it gets a little bit louder. And what does it do? It turns things down.
Eric and Kevin run a predominantly buy-side M&A transaction firm for people buying businesses for less than $7 million.
Yeah, so there you go. So that was a little bit more of a spiky section, but if somebody was to get quiet and start whispering a little bit like that, it will also turn it up. So it saves me a ton of time trying to manually turn things up and down all the time. It's just a ton of clip gaining. That can get really old and tedious. So this does a lot of the work for me. I also like it because it's pretty natural. It takes, there's a lag time between when the signal hits the plugin and when the plugin reacts. And so it's kind of like having a slower attack time on the compressor. So it still lets the transients of the dialogue come through. So it sounds pretty natural, but it's also pretty fast. It's not like it's super slow. It's fast enough to really catch stuff, and because it's turning things up and down, all of my individual tracks, before they hit the mix bus, they're already pretty balanced. So this is doing the majority of the work for me of just leveling. And it does it in a very smooth, transparent way. It doesn't add any color to anything. It doesn't make any EQ changes. So that's huge. So that's always sitting at the end of my chain. So when we're talking about the dynamics, that's a big tool that I use. So now all of those individual tracks, they all have some version of these plugin chain activated, all the individual tracks, whatever they need. And then they all get routed to a bus. I call it the DX bus, kind of after the way film mixers call it, dialogue bus, for lack of a better term. And on this bus, so all of my individual tracks, I can show you the mixer view here. So here are my two individual tracks here. These are flowing into this DX bus here. So the DX bus, all it has is just a little bit more compression on it. And I've got a couple options here, the sort of go-to options for me. I don't use multiple. I just use one compressor of the three. They just have slightly different sounds. I tend to use this MJUC or LA2A. For this particular show, I liked the sound of the LA2A. And what this is doing is it's doing a little bit more compression. So if you have, because think about it, if the individual tracks are all being sort of leveled with the vocal rider, but you have two tracks at the same time, two people talking at the same time or laughing or whatever, then those two tracks are going to sum together to a louder sound than that needs some control, right? So so this thing can be a safety net for if you have multiple people like laughing or talking, or they all get real loud for just a second, it will clamp down on that. And then when one person is talking, I have it set to just do a little tiny bit of compression, not very much, just like 2 or 3 dB of gain reduction. And this just provides, it squishes things down a little bit more, but in a very natural, pleasant way. And the reason, that's why I picked these analog style compressors for this. So the LA2A is an optical style compressor. What that means is that, without going into the details of the circuit, but basically it has a slow attack time and has a pretty slow release time. And it changes, the actual attack and release time is dynamic. It changes depending on the strength of the signal hitting the compressor. So what that means is it just tends to have this like nice, gooey, soft, pillowy sort of sound to it. So speech, which can be kind of spiky, human speech can be kind of up and down a lot. It's not going to react and grab too fast and leave audible artifacts. It's just kind of very slowly pushing things down and slowly letting go. And it's just sitting there riding the waveform, right? Keeping things nice and controlled without ever doing too much. And so you can see if I just let this guy talk.
Eric and Kevin run a predominantly buy-side M&A transaction
so you can see it's
firm
doing 2 to 3
for
dB.
people buying businesses for less than
1 to 3 dB of gain reduction most of the time. It's not very much, And then what I do on top of that, in addition to that, I turn the mix down on this as well. So in Reaper, you can take any plugin and you can give it a dry mix. That's this little tiny button up here. And so I turn it down to where only 70% of the compressor is of the audio going in is getting compressed. The other 30% is going through uncompressed, totally untouched. And so what I find that does is it helps me maintain the transients that are going to keep things sounding clear and defined. I don't want to kill those too much. I don't want to dull the transients too much with compression. So that just helps more of the transients poke through, but the bulk of the signal is still getting compressed and smoothed out. MJUC, this is made by a company called Klanghelm, very affordable compressor. It does a very similar thing. It is based on a Very style compressor rather than an optical style compressor. And but it has this similar effect. Basically, it's the actual attack and release times are fixed on this one. However, the ratio of the compression is dynamic. It will change. The ratio, basically, the more it compresses, the more gain reduction it does, the more ratio applies. So it has a similar effect of being nice and pillowy and soft. It just has a little bit different. It's a little bit stronger, more authoritative sounding. It can kind of sound a little bit more like a radio show. And so not every voice is going to react well to that. That's why I like to have options. The LA2 is a little bit more relaxed sounding. But there you go. Between vocal rider on each of the individual tracks and then all of the tracks getting touched with a little bit of compression here, that is getting things into a nice, smooth, very level and controlled range without giving me weird artifacts where I can hear the compression. It's super smooth sounding, super nice sounding, sounds super natural. And then finally, on the master bus, or the final mix bus, if you want to call it that, I have a few tools here. Let's take a look at those. It's really just a couple things. I have another volume adjuster. That's just to get me to my final range. So it's just adding some gain there. And then I have a limiter. I'm just using the old Waves L2. it's not doing much. It's just if something happens to poke through those layers of compression that I already put in there, it will catch that. And so that's just what it's doing there. And then the last thing, it's not doing any processing. It's just an audio meter that shows me sort of what my level looks like as the thing is playing. So as I let it go,
Eric and Kevin run
you can
a
see it's
predominantly buy-side M&A
measuring the,
transaction firm
loudness.
for,
and it tells me I'm looking mainly at this integrated loudness. So it's loudness over time. And so that tells me kind of roughly what ballpark I'm in. And so I use my ears, and then also I check the meter just to make sure it's not too hot or too soft. So there you go. There's the mix template. And there's also my theory or my philosophy on managing dynamic range, layers of compression. You want multiple layers of compression, each doing just a little bit, as opposed to one layer of compression that's super heavy-handed. That's how you get nice, smooth, very natural sounding, yet also very compressed sounding speech. And you can solve that puzzle we talked about at the beginning of the episode. So I hope that was helpful. I use a lot of third-party plugins. It's just stuff that I like. You can do this with your stock plugins. You can actually do this all with stock plugins in Reaper. So I have a template that I built just in case I lose access to my other plugins for whatever reason. I have a template that's built with only Reaper plugins. And so I'll show that to you in another video if you want to try to build that yourself. But if you use a different DAW, I'm sure that you almost certainly have some tools like that. The only thing that I have not found in most stock DAWs, in their stock plugin tools, is something like Vocal Writer. I have not found a tool like that in a lot of DAWs. There might be some out there. Let me know in the comments if you know of one. But that might be something if you do a lot of this editing, or if you find yourself really, fighting, keeping things within a certain range and doing a lot of editing to control volume, you might look into getting something like Vocal Writer or Wave Writer, or, I think Melda has some sort of auto gain plugin as well. There's a bunch of them out there. But yeah, it might be useful to get a tool like that. But anything else that I'm doing here, you can do in your DAW with stock tools, but it's just knowing kind of the philosophy of how to set everything up to achieve what you're trying to achieve. So hope that's helpful. I'll be back next week with another tip. Catch you later.